recording. And our next talk in the New Work in the Theory of Mind graduate conference here at the University of Bucharest will be given by Marco Facchin from the Istituto Universitario di Studi Superiori Ius Pavia and Zuzanna Rucinska. She's with Antwerp University. And their talk today is titled Enactive Pretending Without Folk Psychology. I'm thrilled for the title and for the talk, and please go ahead.
Okay, so I'll share my screen and well, I'll just start. So the title, as you said, is Enactive Pretending Without Folk Psychology. And we're very happy to be here. So thank you for having us here. And I'll just jump right in as soon as I manage to share my screen properly. So basically, our goal today is to reply to an argument by Peter Langlander's. You can find this argument in Peter's 2021 paper on phenomenology and the cognitive sciences. And the argument allegedly shows that folk psychology and its posits, in particular a certain set of beliefs and intention, are necessary to account for a variety of pretense-related phenomena such as pretend play and pretense used to deceive people, and so on and so forth. And this, Langlander's argues, is a real problem for a number of non-representational approaches to the mind, including the enactive approach. So now, just one word on the enactive approach, and just let us say that we are using the term enactive approach and enactivism very broadly to refer to a series of theory in the philosophy of mind / philosophy of cognitive science that basically make two claims. First claim is that cognition is a matter of agent-environment interaction rather than internal computation. And the second claim is that since cognition is a matter of interaction rather than internal computation, then cognition should not be explained in terms of representations of any sort. So if you understand enactivism in this broad way, you end up with a sort of paradoxical result that you use enactivism also to denote certain non-strictly speaking enactive accounts of the mind, such as this one by Anthony Camara, which is more aligned to ecological psychology than activism strictly understood. Okay, so with this caveat out of the way, let me tell you what we'll plan to do today. And well, basically we'll do three things. We'll start laying down Langlander's arguments. Then I'll try to persuade you that these arguments actually phase. And then I'll leave the floor to Zuzanna, and she will give you a positive story concerning how an activist can account for pretense without having to rely on folk psychological posits. Okay, so let's start with Peter's Langlander's arguments, and we think that the argument starts from a correct assumption, which is that any decent account of pretense must be able to tell apart pretense from non-pretense, must be able to tell apart who's pretending from who isn't. You must be able to use it as a tool to identify pretenders and non-pretenders. And we think that this is 100% correct. Now, how can we tell apart the two, pretenders and non-pretenders? Well, since enactivists think that cognition is a matter of agent-environment interaction, they might be tempted to try and tell apart the two just by looking at how agents interact with their environments. But Langlander's claims that cannot be the right way to do it. That cannot be true. Why? Well, because pretenders and non-pretenders can act exactly alike. And to substantiate that claim, Langlander's presents a number of thought experiments. Here we'll run through just one, just to give you the flavor of Peter Langlander's argument. So we have Mo, which is this guy right here, which is a troll from the land of trolls. And Mo does not know what a bird is, has never seen a bird, nor has even heard of a bird. but still Mo is running around with his feet on the ground and arms outstretched in this way. So Mo does not know what a bird is, and so can Mo be pretending to be a bird? Most have assumed that. Langlander's concurs that you cannot pretend to be something without trying to be like that thing, and you clearly cannot try to be like something you know nothing about. So Mo is not pretending, in spite of the fact that it's acting as if it was pretending to be a bird. And so something else, something in addition to agent-environment interactions. And according to Langlander's what the right sort of extra ingredient are a specific combination of folk psychological attitudes, namely beliefs concerning the target of pretense and intention to act in, say, target-like way. But clearly, those folk psychological attitudes are representations. Beliefs are the sort of things that can be true or false, and so they clearly are representations. And if that is correct, then PSD enactive approach representations are needed to account for at least some cognitive phenomena, namely those related to pretense. And that is, in a very compressed, say, nutshell, Peter Langlander's argument. Okay, so now I think hard part of my half of the talk, that is try and persuade you that this argument, as simple as prima facie convincing as it may be, actually fails. So we want to counteract these arguments, and in order to do so, to show you that this argument fails, we're gonna claim that pretenders and non-pretenders cannot, as a matter of contingent empirical fact, but cannot act in the same way. There will be difference in agent-environment interaction that tell apart pretenders from non-pretenders. And this minimally is due to certain well-known facts concerning the sensory motor control of our action. So let us introduce corollary discharges. So what are corollary discharges? Basically, they are copies of the neural signals that are sent through the spine to muscle to elicit movement. And those copies are used by your brain, basically, to predict and anticipate the changes in sensory stimulation that your movement will bring about. So if you want to literally see corollary discharges in action, all you have to do, as Helmut's show, is just to cover one eye and gently push the other eye. And you will see the visual world shifting around. That's not super surprising if you are moving your eye. But this simple fact becomes surprising when you notice that you are constantly moving your eyes to gaze upon various pieces of environmental information. So why don't we always see our visual environment jumping around and moving about? Well, because of corollary discharges, because 99% of our eye movements are not due to us pushing our eyes around, and so they are due to contraction in the muscle in our eyes. And so we have appropriate corollary discharges that enable us to anticipate the changes in sensory stimulation. And that's why we don't perceive the world as floating and jumping around, in spite of the fact that we constantly move our eyes. Okay, now let us connect corollary discharges to pretense. And to do so, we need to introduce Waiter's tasks. So what are Waiter's tasks? Well, a well-known class of tasks that have been really thoroughly studied in motor control. If you want a very long review, look at Woodford and Flanagan 2001 on current biology. But the basic gist concerning this sort of task is this. You have an experimental subject holding an object that is registering the sort of grip the subject has on it. And then the subject or a third party adds a load or a force to the object. Now, when the subject adds the load or the force, basically pushes the object, there is no slippage. The grip and the increase of load, the increase of grip and increase of load are simultaneous. Why? Well, because the subject is acting. So the subject has a corollary discharge that enables him, in this case, to anticipate the sensory consequences of his action, and so it can adjust his grip proactively. However, when the increase of load is due to a third party, the subject cannot rely on corollary discharges to anticipate the changes in sensory stimulation. And so the object will slip a bit. And then the subject will perceive this slip and adjust the grip accordingly. But you have some slight temporal delay between the increase of load and change in grip. Okay, how is any of this related to pretense? Well, to see how this relates to pretense, now imagine two subjects. One is actually holding a heavy object to which a third party is adding some load, as a waiter which is receiving some other plates on their hands. And the second subject is merely pretending to be carrying an heavy object to which someone else is adding a load. Now, clearly, those two subjects will act in slightly different ways, because the non-pretending subject will have to compensate the actual increase of load, adjusting the grip and performing a number of perhaps postural readjustments to avoid letting the load fail. Whereas the pretending subject will have to do nothing of that sort. There is no actual increase of load, so no actual changes in grip are triggered by the incoming sensory flux. So their agent-environment interaction will be perhaps very subtly, but they will be. Now, you could reply, okay, Marco, cool, neurological facts, but this is a very niche example. The problem is that we think that the general point here generalizes, because the sensory flows of pretenders and non-pretenders are bound to be different. They are bound to differ. If you are really feeling the texture of the steering wheel and the resistance of the pedal, and you're really hearing the roaring of the engine of your car, then you're not just pretending to driving your car, you are actually driving your car, right? So there will always be different sensory flows coming apart pretenders and non-pretenders. And so all the adjustments that these sorts of all the postural and motoric adjustment that those sensory flow will call for will be different and can be used to tell apart the two. They will force the pretender and non-pretenders to act, perhaps in very subtle ways, but different. And so actually pretenders and non-pretenders cannot act in the exact same way. Now, let me add a last point before leaving the floor to Zuzanna. And the last point I want to add is this one. That, strictly speaking, all we need to show you to diffuse Langland-Assange challenge is that pretenders and non-pretenders do not act in the exact same way. And that, we think, is what our arguments actually show. We don't have to commit to the additional claim that those perhaps extremely subtle differences are what, in virtue of which the subject is pretending and the other is not pretending. But we are not committed to the claim that those very subtle differences that are bound to be there are what constitute pretense versus non-pretending behavior. We're claiming just that those very subtle, perhaps differences, are enough to tell apart the two. And then I'll leave the floor to Zuzanna for the last half, perhaps, of our talk. And I remind you to change your Zoom settings so that you can see her speaking rather than me.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Marco. And for those of you on Zoom, if you want to see me talking now, what you need to do is click on the right-hand side top button called View, and just change it to the gallery setting or standard setting, and then you'll be able to see my face as I give the talk. And Marcos will be moving the slides. Thank you. Right. Let's recall Peter's argument again. We learned that any decent account of pretense must be able to tell apart pretense from non-pretense, and that the enactivist might be tempted to tell apart the two by looking how agent interacts with the environment. Clearly, we're very tempted to give that account, right? But he says, aha, but that's going to come with a price. What he thinks is a revisionary understanding of pretense itself, where, and he makes 4 points, one where two people simply cannot engage in identical behaviors while only one is pretending, and as Marco showed, we have already dismissed that possibility, where deception is not a form of pretense, where many of the judgments we might ordinarily make about who is pretending and who is not are incorrect, and where pretense is merely an interpersonal game with no deep different system over games. Now, we don't have the time or space to talk about all of these points, but I will now discuss this last point. And then in short, the challenge is supposed to be that the enactivist really cannot explain what makes pretense this special, unique game or phenomenon. So consider this question again, right? Are affordances sufficient? Is that going to be a good enough story? Because how else, right? Other than by invoking these folk psychological states, can the enactivist really explain the difference between non-pretending and non-pretending subjects? Let me just clarify that we are not discussing other options right now that are in the literature, which is that you are imagining these differences, things like that. We can discuss that in the Q&A. But we're just dealing with Peter's proposal that it has to be a set of beliefs and desires, and our story, which is the affordance story. So, as I said, an activist can call upon different affordances and the environmental and social factors to really be able to explain that difference. And Peter will say that affordances are not specific enough. I will explain why in a second. And that's a claim we will reject. But first, we can actually go on the offensive. And we should actually ask, are folk psychological states really better explanatory tools? So this is us going on the offensive, right? We could say, look, Peter, maybe relying on this intention belief pair is actually not being more specific at all, especially if you're going to be agnostic about the physical basis of these attitudes. So if you're not going to tell us how they cash out, right? Is it language of thought? He doesn't want to say that. Is it something else? It's not giving a more precise or specific story. And secondly, actually relying on these intention belief pairs is kind of known to be trivially true. If there is no substantial or detailed proposal concerning the physical bits and pieces, as we call them, that enable an agent to pretend, then folk psychological ascriptions will be notoriously cheap to make, as already was pointed out by Dennett some time ago. So in a way, Peter Langland-Hassan's folk psychological account, you can say, we can nicely say that it is just as undeveloped as ours, if not less developed than the enactivist ones. That in fact, the enactivists can use tools like affordances, and when we do so, it's complex maybe to do so, but it's actually an explanation that's not going to be trivially true. It's actually going to be empirical proposal, because proving that will require to call upon a number of formal mathematical tools to model the relevant agent-environment interactions and affordances, as have all these other people tried to do already, not for pretense, but for other phenomena in the literature. So then moving on to the positive story, we don't just want to be dismissive of Peter's proposal. Okay, let's talk about this enactive account of pretense, and I will just give one slide of the gist of an affordance-based enactive account of pretense play. I say affordance-based because I accept that there might be other enactivists who do not wish to refer to the concept of affordances, which comes from ecological psychology. But well, my account is, and our account here is very much in favor of affordances. And here we just want to say simply that pretense involves manipulations of objects in the world, and exploring these new possibilities for actions or affordances for play. The ability to see those affordances combined with embodied actions will very much be sufficient for most kinds of pretend play. Like, sure, there are some very complex forms of pretense where you need maybe language and narratives, and that builds on very much our basic ability to just manipulate objects, interact with the world, and see possibilities for playful actions. And importantly, other people shape what affordances we see and respond to in the environment through guidance, verbal feedback, reassurances, gestures, and other responses. So when this boy is, exploring the subject, and we don't know yet if we can genuinely say he's pretending, not pretending, and then the parent helps them and says, "Oh, good, look at you pouring tea here." All this builds our capacities and our understanding of pretense. So the outcome will be that when you're pretending, you're actually presenting or performing or enacting a whole scenario in the world. You're not representing it in the mind in advance of the action. So it's not the case that the pretense is happening in the head and then there's just some silly behavior that shows for it. But in the acting, that boy is now pretending that, he's serving tea, for example. So we know from Gibson that affordances of the environment are supposed to be what it offers the animal, provides or furnishes either for good or ill. But Gibson did not really talk about this social aspect, social nature of affordances that I think is quite important, where we should really think of affordances as relations between an agent's ability and the environmental features relevant to the execution of those abilities. So the kind of typical example we give is of a chair sittability on a chair, right? There's a chair and there's a force sitting on. It depends, of course, on your capacities and the context you're in. So if you're an expert breakdancer, you're going to see that possibility for action on a chair, like making this cool flip. And if you're an expert athlete, a basketball player, you can actually play professional basketball on a chair, on the specific chair, and give other people hugs. So these are affordances that come with the territory of gaining, of your social environment and your expertise. So therefore, when we're talking about the environment where we see affordances, we have to include the social environment. Right. So now, when we're talking about affordances for play, let's say that there are two kinds of affordances. We can call them canonical and non-canonical. So canonical affordances are the easy ones. These are where we have games of pretense that involve props, and their canonical affordances support the relevant type of pretense. So here is a toy frying pan, and it's clearly affording a very specific kind of play, right? To pretend to fry and cook things in it. And when the canonical affordances of objects are exploited, we might say that the agent is pretending. Like when you have these specific tools that form the board of the Dungeons and Dragons game. So again, the canonical affordances of objects will allow us to tell apart games of pretense from other games or activities. So the more interesting or the difficult ones are supposed to be the non-canonical affordances, right? Where we take something that's supposed to mean something else. Like here's the banana, and we're treating it as if it is a telephone. And here we want to say that, look, you're really just stepping away or in a way disregarding the canonical affordance of an object and exploring its other affordances in play. The same way, the breakdancer doesn't just sit on a chair, he starts dancing with it. And these objects that we're playing with, they have various degrees of fit for play, what Sokolsky and Reed call affordance-based functional fitness. So when we look at the boy who's pretending to make pizza, he's actually kneading the bread and he used a pillow for it. And the pillow makes much more of a fun game of being a pizza man or bread maker than having like a perfect little toy representation of a pizza, let's say. So importantly for us, we don't have time to explore this more, but we want to say that you don't need to be bypassing something like the original meaning or like the primary representation of seeing the banana as a banana, and now somehow you have to see it as something else, a phone. That's not the enactivist story. We propose that meanings are really created in the interaction. That's a concept from of sense making we find in Ezekiel De Paulo and Hannah de Jager's work, and many others, including Sean Gallagher as well. So this is the kind of end of this our positive story, because this is where we would have to say much more to convince you, but this is the gist of the proposal, that affordances can explain pretend play. Yeah. But now Peter says, well, still affordances are not going to be specific enough. And there's a quote from a paper. He says, to simply say that pretending involves acting on affordances does not move us forward, as non-pretend actions involve the same. We would need some account of what is distinctive about the affordance acted upon during pretense. So that to us is like, we understand it in the following way. Is he calling for us to provide a special pretense affordances or invoke special pretense property, right? That seems to be the assumption behind this comment. So, and it becomes more clear when he gives an example of the drunkard. And the example goes like this. Imagine a drunk person at a bar who accidentally reaches for a banana instead of a telephone to make a call home. Right, and the intuition here is supposed to be, well, look, this drunkard, right, is exploiting the same phone-related affordances, right, of a banana as the pretending child, only she's doing so by mistake. And according to Peter, the focus or desire attention pair can best explain where it is a game of pretense. So that's why he says affordances are not good enough. We need to intend to look like you're making a phone call while believing you will not make a phone call. And those folk psychological states are able to tell apart these two situations. Right, so to that, we have a very simple reply. We're saying, look, Peter and everybody else, there is no telephoning affordances of a banana, right? You cannot make a phone call from a banana if you really, even if you really try really hard. Like, that's clear, and we're not positing that there are some special telephoning affordances of a banana. What the child is exploiting is affordances to pretend to call from a banana. That will be exploring the banana's suitability to hold it to the ear in order to imitate the receiver. But the drunkard is clearly not doing that. First of all, if she was doing that, she would be actually in a completely different way. That the drunkard's grip of the situation is actually different. Can you all hear me still? Yes, okay. Right, so then just to finish up on this point, do we need a special pretense property? And our answer is clearly no, we don't. So what makes certain affordances pretense supporting will just be the fact that they support acts of pretense. And now compare, let's make an analogous argument, right? Think about affordances supporting nourishment of aloes or papaya or sugar, right? These foods don't have special nourishing properties, even though that's sometimes how it's explained. I don't know how it's described online, but they have affordances supporting nourishment, and they are such affordances just because they support or nourish an agent. But that would be the case for a diabetic, for example. It all has to be contextual. It's all kind of relevant to your situation. So just like we don't need to posit a special nourishing property of these foods, we don't need a special pretense property of objects either. And it is possible to explain why an object affords pretense by citing variety of facts concerning the material properties of the prop, agent skills, social embedding, all conspiring to enable and support that specific pretense behavior. So now to conclude, we'll like to make 3 points. First of all, that contrary to Langland Hassan's opinion, enactivists can explain the difference between pretense and non-pretense behaviors. The non-pretender can never act exactly like the pretender, as Marco has shown us, but the behavior is never going to be exactly the same. And the case in point, we heard about corollary discharges. And what I said was that belief desire tests, well, they do not explain what makes pretense special and unique phenomenon, but actually affordances can explain. And so Peter got things of a way around. So we'd like to thank you now for your attention and just draw your attention to, well, two publications. One is it's a preprint, not really. If you want to know more about this argument, it's we have a paper that's being reviewed right now, and we're happy to discuss it with people here at the conference if you want to know more. And there is a special issue in Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences that came out last December on pretense and imagination from the perspective of 4E cognitive science. And over there, you can read the paper of Peter and Dan Hatto's reply, my reply, and some other excellent texts about enactive pretense. Yeah, so we would both like to thank you for your attention.
Great, that's fantastic. Thanks so much. And everybody, I'm sure, joins me in applauding you. And I hope you can hear the guys in the room as well. Okay.
Yes.
Great, terrific. So let's dive into Q&A. And so if there's anyone who'd like to kickstart the Q&A session, Sean, please go ahead.
Okay, let me turn things on. Oops, there you go. Yeah, so I really like the arguments that you guys have outlined, and I think it's really important to look at those details, specifically of motor control, and I think that was quite interesting. But then just about that point, I'm wondering, you know, there might be instances where perhaps the corollary discharge is exactly the same for pretending and for not pretending. So I would think an example might be a child who's playing at a the tea party idea, pouring tea. You had a picture of that type of thing going on. And if they actually had water in the little teapot and they were pouring water, they were pretending to be pouring tea and to be at a tea party. But I would think the motor processes would be pretty much the same, unless I'm missing something. So I agree with the example that you did give, that the motor properties would be different, corollary discharge would be different. And that's if you're imagining something that's not actually there. But here, you're actually just pretending that the water is tea. So I wonder if you have a response to that particular example.
And maybe I can say something very quickly, and then I will give the floor to Marco because he's more informed on corollary discharges. But the brief response would be that I don't know how to answer your question, but I would just say that we never claim that having the different corollary discharge is the thing that explains the difference between the pretenders, right? That wasn't our claim. That was just an argument to say that, look, there's never exactly the same behavior going on, but from the corollary discharges and this biological explanation, what we're missing is the context, is the social surroundings. So to have a proper, explanation of the difference between the two, it might be difference in corollary discharges plus the context. And maybe in this case, you happen to have exactly the same discharges, but of course the context is going to be different. But now maybe Marco has something more interesting to say.
Okay.
I don't think anything specifically on corollary discharges. So it's right. They're probably, if you look at just the decontextualized act of the person pouring tea in the cup and the child pouring water in the cup, on the pure motor control level, they are indistinguishable. But still, you have relevant differences in the way in which the two agents interact with the environment, because in one case, you actually have to put the tea in the hot water, and in the other case, you clearly don't have to put the tea in the hot water. Otherwise, you wouldn't be just pretending to do pouring tea, right? So there is still a difference in agent-environment interaction. It's just in a previous time slice of the act, if you want.
Okay. So yeah, so I guess I take your point that you have to look at a lot of the other details involved, including maybe social. And it might be, you might also think that just the way someone who is pretending to pour tea, I don't know, the empirical test, empirical studies would have to be done, but maybe they look at the other person. If they're interacting with another person, they look at the other person slightly differently, or their gestures might be slightly different from if they were really having tea with the other person. But okay, thanks.
Yeah, just to add to that, in our paper that's under review now, we talk about various other cases. We just presented you with two, but we did the whole Denetian thing of having many different cases. And we talked about a private investigator, right, who is pretending to be a waiter. And of course, when the investigator who's a waiter is serving you the tea, they might go through exactly the same motions and have a real tray and have real tea, but they'll be paying attention to different things, to eavesdropping on your conversation. So exactly, the whole interaction setting might be completely different here too. Thank you, Sean.
Great, thanks to all. And our next question comes from Agata Makchevich-Gad. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, very well. Thank you very much. I think my remark will be to much extent similar to the previous one, but maybe I just wonder if it could be like the concern could be spelled in a more, so to say, general way, because I didn't read, I don't know the paper by Langlam Hassam where he presents his argument, but I'm wondering if like the, so to say, logical form of the argument weren't that you need, as in many thought experiments, that you all you need to succeed in the argument is that there is one pair of behaviors which like are really identical under the, say, behavioral description, because I suspect that's the description of the behavior that he may have in mind. But still, we wouldn't count them as but still, we would like to have that one of them is pretense and another one isn't pretense, right? So I'm wondering if that were the structure of the argument, then if the counter argument which consists in pointing to an example where, like yours with the waiter, were successful, right? Because maybe all he needs is one case where we have the this identity of behavior without both cases being the same when it comes to being pretense or not being pretense. And I was just thinking about, I'm not sure if it's a good example, but I was looking for one that could be plausible, and I was thinking about an actor on a scene who is in a way very skillful in her pretense, right? And probably on the the very sensory motorical level, and for sure on the behavioral level, her behavior would be exactly like the behavior of a, you know, some other person who acts genuinely and not does not pretend. Yeah, and of course, that's my last remark. Of course, one can always say that on the level of, you know, neurological description, the one who pretends and the one who doesn't always differ, because there will be, you can say that the neurological correlate of the intention would make the difference, right? But I suppose that what, we should, you know, think about the question of what aspect of what identity the author of the argument has in mind, because probably he has in mind, as I said, the behavior described behaviorally, right? And then he can say that those behaviors identical under this, you know, when it comes to this aspect, we like feel inclined to say that one of them is pretense and another is not a pretense, and then a propositional attitude like intention or a pair of belief and pre-attitude is a like plausible candidate to you know, when it comes to pointing at the feature that would be responsible for this difference. Thank you, and sorry for being long.
So that was quite a question. I'm wondering if Zuzanna or Marco would like to approach it first.
I can go, but Marco, do you want to go too first?
Okay, I can start. So that was a long question. There are two things I want to say to try and reply to it. The first one is that our claim is not that the difference is in neurological correlates. Our claim is that there is a difference in neurological correlate that forces the behavior to diverge of the pretender and the non-pretender. So to give just another example, suppose that you have one agent driving and the other that is just pretending to drive this way with no steering wheel in hand, and suppose that the actual driving person is moving in the exact same way, but for whatever reason the steering wheel gets clogged, and so you have to use more physical force to steer the car. In this case, you have two subjects that are in different neurological states, but the difference in neurological states and the difference in expected sensory flow cause their behavior to differ, right? When the steering wheel gets clogged, you have the sudden moment of, holy, wow, what's happening? And the freezing response of your muscle, and then the added strength in your muscle movement, right? And that's a behavioral difference. And that's the first point. And the second point I wanted to make is this one. That Peter Langlander's claims that pretenders and non-pretenders can act in the exact same way, down to the very smallest contraption of your finger muscle or whatever, but is not trying to make a logical point. It's not trying to argue that it is conceivable that pretenders and non-pretenders may act in the exact same way in some possible world. Is trying to provide an account of pretense in this world, and so showing that in this world, the pretenders and non-pretenders cannot actually act in the exact same way to us insufficient to reply. I don't know if it does answer your question.
Yeah,
Or
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Zuzanna
For now, yes. I'm maybe I'll only clarify what I meant by had in mind by speaking of the like logical structure or something. I only meant that what he may have in mind is that you need only one example, right? Not the like it doesn't need to be a general truth, but probably one example will suffice to like prove that this, to point to this like definitional this distinctive feature of pretense, right? That's why I had in mind when I was pointing to the logical structure of the argument.
I can address that if I may, just briefly. But here's the notorious problem with philosophers, right? Where they think they can give you can do. It's essentially a zombie argument, like what Chalmers is. What Chalmers did. Peter's doing the same thing. Like, let's have a thought experiment where we can have identical behavior, and we should already be asking whether or not we're conceiving too much, if we even allow, such a possibility, because it seems like Peter is not really arguing against enactivism, but against a very crude form of behaviorism, right? Where the mere behavior is exactly the same, and we can hold that in place. And now we can, we need something else. But of course, I think that's so in a way, we could even go much more on the offensive and say, I don't think he even got the enactivist project, because in our view, there is no such thing as crude behavior. And we're very much interested in what the children and pretenders are actually doing in the world, and the real differences between them and other people. And not like to make a hypothetical thought experiment, which are, they're easy to make, and there's always really easy to make very good counterexamples. And philosophers have been doing this tennis game forth and back for a very long time. So I wouldn't be too worried about, like, I think I understand you might be right in terms of what he was trying to get at, and here it might be a completely like a miscommunication in terms of what the enactivist project is really about. So I would just say that.
Thank you. Just one. I'm sorry for taking more time. Only one short answer. I fully understand that you may be skeptical to to those philosophical popularity of thought experiment in philosophical discourse, and that's okay for me if you answer that. I would need a real world example, right? Not only the claim that something is possible, but my question is simply whether you agree that once Langland Hassam would find such one word, real, actual example, whether his argument would be successful then, right? I mean, because then it would prove, it would show that my interpretation of his argument is like it's right. I think it's an issue somewhat different from the issue of whether to prove the accuracy of thought experiment, it's enough to say that something is conceivable, or whether we have to point to a real world example.
And
sorry,
if I chime in and abuse my privilege as a chair, I'm just going to paraconsistently go ahead and agree with you all. It seems to me that there are some dialectical niceties that are difficult to sort out in theory, and are best left to the specific details. But thanks, Saul. We've got a wonderful queue of questions. Martina, with your permission, let's take a question from the room, and then we'll come back to yours. All right? But then you go ahead.
Yes, thank you, and very nice presentation. I have the following one observation and then one case to discuss. So the observation would be that even for pretenders, I don't think we should look for identity in action. So even, let's say, the child that pretends to pour the tea, he'll do it a bit differently each time. So I don't think we should think that there is an identity in action even for pretenders. So then if we remove this idea that we should be totally identical, let's imagine the following situation of a pretender, the child that pretends to pour the tea, and then some other child that just imitates this child. So they don't know that it's pouring tea. Their action will be, let's say that we have a good imitator. So the difference, it appears not to be actually in motor action. The difference appears to be somewhere in the mind, actually, with the intention to or the belief that we are pouring the tea, in one case being present, and the absence of that beliefs and intentions in the imitator's case. So I would like to see if you can comment on this.
Zuzanna, you want to start?
Thanks. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's like I know you don't mean to be probably difficult, but you're trying to drag us back into this belief desire terminology. But there's a couple of things to say to that maybe. Well, there's I think at least two avenues. Let me just point out like what I think are enactivist possibilities. One would be to specify now the difference between someone who just, imitates the action and then the one who is genuinely, engaging in the action in some enactivist ways. I think there has been some literature. There's already some literature on that. There's been some proposals. So there's a way to do it without invoking folk psychological language. And then there might be conceiving a form of folk psychology, and kind of it relates back to maybe like, the Dan's presentation in the morning. Like maybe for some enactivists or enactivism in general, we don't need to deny that some situations you can describe as maybe it will be best. It'll be easiest to clarify from this third person perspective that person believes that they're doing this and the other one doesn't really believe. So it's not like this terminology is maybe off limit to the enactivists, but since it's usually cashed out in the representational ways, we've been stepping away from it. But I think the real question is going to be like, why should an activist accept that this pretense act or the imitation act must be distinguishable from non-pretense act by a third party, right? Because that's the perspective we're looking at. From the first person perspective, they both know kind of what they're doing. They know, from the action from the inside, they know what's going on. So now we're trying to really seem to explain how to best cash it out from this third person perspective, and this is where it seems like it gets tricky. And I just want to point out this map. I'm not really answering your question straight ahead, but I'm hoping that at least this clarifies how to approach this kind of question.
Thank you, Zuzanna.
Marco, do you want to say something?
No, it was perfect. And also I think we were short of time, so Martina wants.
Well, that's excellent agreement amongst authors. So let's go to Martina's question. Thanks so much for your patience.
Thank you so much. How much time do we have? Because I actually have two questions, but I can choose one if I have to.
We're running a bit late, but with hang on a second. With David and Agata's permission, perhaps we might delve a bit longer. So go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you so much. I'll be super quick. Okay, Zuzanna and Marco, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. One question that I have is basically about the positive story. So Zuzanna, maybe a little bit more to you. So you have been talking about pretend play, and I have, as far as I understood, sometimes it's kind of the object-agent interaction, but sometimes it involves more agents, right? And then you talked about the canonical versus non-canonical, and I was super curious about how this would, like the canonical versus non-canonical, how this would look like if there were more agents involved, like what example is it that you would give? So that's one question. And then I'll jump immediately into the second one. So the second one would be, so you were making this claim that you would say that there's no like phonability affordance of a banana, right? And this kind of rings close to me to what like Tony Chemero is talking about in his book about social affordances, that like if you see the beer can, then there's that kind of the social affordance of the beer there. And I was wondering whether you would put this in the same category, whether you would like completely throw out all of those social affordances with that, because I like thinking about like what Tony Chemero was saying about affordances, I kind of thought like it would go, maybe there is this like phonability affordance in this sense. So I was just curious what you think about both of these questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for both questions. Are really good questions, and I will give Marco a chance to respond too. I think he might have very interesting, maybe even different views than mine. But yeah, canonical, non-canonical. So I have written quite a lot about non-canonical affordances, right? Like the banana phone kind of games, where because that's supposed to be this problematic case for an activist, right? How do you treat something as if it's something else? And that's where I think this having other agents really helps, because like we learn. So a lot of these examples Leslie talks about, or Curry, or all these philosophers, they talk about the banana phone game, but they don't barely look at the context in which it shows up. And very often, like it's like a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, they're playing with it, they're saying hello to it, always checking, always looking at, the parent or somebody else, like, are they getting it? Is it funny? And they get this reinforcement that this is really a game, this is okay to play this way. Is it really for real or not for real? Well, they're in a different play context. So I don't like to say things like, oh, one is real and one is not real. You're just in the play context and non-play context, and other people help you kind of establish, I think, the play context, right? Maybe that's a loaded kind of comment, but agents will be involved here. And canonical affordances, we just said, like, look, some props, there are clear props that invite a specific form of playing. So those would be the canonical affordances for games. What do more agents do here? I guess they could be, they would do, if everybody's playing according to the prop, right? They're reinforcing that this is the sense we can make of that prop. But possibly there could be interesting cases where you jointly step away from that meaning, right? That original, the canonical affordance, and you try to do something else. So that would be very interesting to explore. And then the second point about, I'm not sure if I remember now, whether the affordance of whether there are social affordances. According to Ed Gibbs, all affordances are social affordances already. So I don't know if maybe in the end that distinction is useful or not. I'm just going to be very. I'm just gonna leave it with a bomb here. It's really hard to say when affordance is social and not social. I mean, we can look at how Gibson was studying just the environment and the birds and animals, and maybe there is a way to talk about affordances of the environment, and then there's this big schism where language comes in, and all of a sudden affordances for language users are completely different. But some people think of language as affording interactions as well. Like I say, we're playing a catch game, and then all of a sudden I say bomb, and now we're playing a bomb game, and affords a different context. So there's a lot to be said about that I don't have time for, and I want to give Marco a chance to speak up as well.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing on social affordances, which is probably not the wisest thing to say in this context, but I'll say it nevertheless. And what I want to say is that I'm a bit hesitant in treating them as sort of superspatial affordances that need a separate treatment. Because it seems to me that they can be treated as regular affordances, a sort of combination of features that are present in a concrete situation and abilities of an agent. So if I'm a very well-versed speaker, then a certain social situation might afford me throwing some jokes or puns or whatever. Whereas if I'm myself, basically, it won't afford me any of that. So I would be a bit skeptical in using in thinking that social affordances are special in a special way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
That's a fantastic Q&A. I'm delighted. Please join me once again in thanking Marco and Zuzanna.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.